Hi, my name is Jens Soering, and I spent 33 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. I was released on parole without a pardon. And since my release, there's been a Netflix series and other stuff published that makes me look guilty, as if I'd actually committed the crime, even though I didn't. And today I'm speaking with Steve Northup to clear up some background facts, specifically on the DNA tests, whether they're reliable or not. Steve Northup was my lawyer for about 2.5 years, from 2017 until my release in 2019. And since my release, we've become friends. We've had a lot of contact, and we'll talk about it in this video. But today we're talking about the DNA and the specific aspect of the DNA tests. Steve is known in Virginia as being an expert on the parole system and the pardon system. He's represented many clients on parole and many clients on pardons, and he was lead counsel on a pretty famous Virginia case called Burnett versus Fahey. Maybe, Steve, you can tell our viewers a little bit about who you are and your expertise on parole and pardon.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm a retired partner with a major international law firm now known as Troutman Pepper. I think at the time I was asked to consider joining the team of lawyers representing you, our firm was known as Troutman Sanders.
I was very, very disappointed not to get a pardon. And there was a brief moment where I considered refusing parole and staying in prison to force them to give me a pardon. And I was able to call somebody, and that person talked me out of that. It's somebody that we both know. I don't want to say the name here, but I was able to call that person, and he told me, get your head straight and come out of prison. For me, it was bitter. It was bitter. Do you have any thoughts about why I was not granted a pardon, why I was released on parole? Do you have any theory of why that happened, some speculation?
I do, and let me say, I don't know the actual reason why the governor decided not to grant you a pardon. I assume, and I think this is a safe assumption, that he got a recommendation from the parole board not to issue a pardon to you. And I assume that the parole board, in making that recommendation, gave a reason or reasons for the recommendation. But we don't know what they are, and I've never been able to find out what those reasons are. However, my speculation is, and this is informed speculation, so it's not just a wild guess, is that they use as a pretext for denying the pardon petition the proposition that the DNA testing did not fully exonerate you because the blood samples that were subjected to DNA testing either were or could very likely have been mixtures. And you say we're going to do this at another call to get into the DNA issue and the fact that that proposition has now been fully refuted. This is after you already got released on parole. We did this, and we refuted that completely. But I still believe that's probably the pretext that they relied on to deny you a pardon.
Well, Steve, let me say that I've done a lot of these interviews now with other police officers who worked on this case. And in every one of these interviews, I've learned significant, important new facts that I did not know. And this just happened again in this interview with you. So please say it again so that a dummy like me can understand.
Yeah.
You said it's informed speculation, but it's informed speculation. So you have reason to believe that I was not granted a pardon specifically because they said we're not sure that the blood samples might not have been mixtures. Could you elaborate on that? Just repeat so that I can understand it, because I'm shocked. I'm sitting here shocked.
Sure. Well, let me back up. We know that the Virginia State Lab at some point concluded, and we were told this, concluded that the blood samples were mixtures. That was their position. It was the position of Betty Lane Desports, who is a local lawyer and who has a lot of experience in this area. That's what she concluded. So we know that at one point, the Department of Forensic Scientists, the state lab, had taken the position that the blood samples were mixtures. Now we, in our arguing on behalf of a pardon, I think completely refuted that in our arguments. But I think at the end of the day, we were probably not successful in overcoming that position. And again, this is speculation on my part, but it is not just a wild guess. The reason I say this is there was really no other reason that they could have relied on to deny the pardon request, to take the position that you were in fact not innocent. Because the fact of the matter is, as you well know, we had more than just the DNA evidence to support our argument that you were in fact innocent. There was a lot of circumstantial evidence in addition to that scientific evidence. But without question, when you're handling an innocence case as a lawyer, the gold star of evidence of innocence is scientific evidence, it's forensic evidence, because it can't be disputed. If you have circumstantial evidence, well, somebody can come in with a different point of view and say, well, the circumstances don't persuade me. But if you have circumstantial evidence of innocence plus scientific evidence of innocence, it's very difficult for a skeptic to come to the conclusion that your client is not in fact innocent. That's why I speculate that they relied on the false refutation of the DNA evidence in your case based upon the false proposition that the blood samples that were tested that did not include your DNA were mixtures.
So for the clarity of the listeners and viewers, basically what happened, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Department of Forensic Sciences said that the blood samples were mixtures. And we had two scientists, Dr. Moses Shanefield and Dr. Thomas McClintock from George Washington University and Liberty University, and they said they were not mixtures. And so the governor's investigator had basically two conflicting opinions. The Department of Forensic Sciences, it's a mixture. These two professors saying it's not a mixture. And because it wasn't clear which one of them was right, they said, well, we can't give him a pardon. We'll just give him parole.
I think that's a fair summary of what happened. We actually took some steps, and I think this was, about 2 years ago, Jens? I can't remember. I think it might have been during the pandemic.
It was 2022. It was
okay, good. That feels about right. We took some steps to actually get to the bottom of that.
I'd like to insert a quick question here, right? Because since my release, I've been accused of being afraid of what the DNA test results would show in this case. And maybe you want to tell our viewers who came up with this idea.
So what led to what we did in 2022 when we, in fact, got to the bottom of this claim that the blood samples were mixtures was the fact that you wanted us to do that because other people were saying that you were guilty and that the DNA evidence did not, in fact, exonerate you. And you wanted us to do whatever we could to refute that argument. And so we did.
That's you and Steve Rosenfield, our friend, who is now moved to another state and is unfortunately very ill and is not able to do one of these interviews, which is really sad. But I think he was already moved to another state at that point. You were the one who did all the legwork in Virginia in 2022 and contacted the Department of Forensic Sciences to get Professor McClintock back into the DFS. You want to talk about what you did back then?
Sure. I called, and it was a woman, and she could not have been friendlier. We had a very nice conversation. I told her who I was, why I was calling, what we wanted to do. We wanted to get our expert to be able to have access again, to be able to reaccess the blood evidence that was DNA tested several years ago to determine once and for all whether those blood samples are mixtures. And she said they'd be willing to do that. And so there were several calls that we did in order to get this all set up, and we had to get Dr. McClintock. We had to have it done at a time when he was available. It was complicated by the fact that we were still in the pandemic. This was in 2022. People were still concerned. People were still wearing masks, for example. But the bottom line is the Department of Forensic Science allowed Dr. McClintock to come to the lab and re-inspect and retest and relook at those blood samples. And I don't know, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know specifically what Dr. McClintock did, but what I do know is that he confirmed his original conclusion that the blood samples are not, in fact, mixtures.
So that's important. And the person at the Department of Forensic Sciences, because you copied me into these emails, who that we spoke with, was actually their counsel. Her name was Amy Curtis back then, if I remember correctly. I see you nodding, so it brings you back in memory. In my opinion, she really went out of her way and just really did a great job, and she was very open, and I want to thank her for making this possible. And the other thing is that the people at the lab then brought an old computer out of storage because they needed an old computer to read the old data, They really went out of their way. And then they also found somebody at the lab, a lab employee, to stay with Professor McClintock and work with him. So it's not just his word. There was a Department of Forensic Sciences scientist who was with him while he was looking at all this. And he looked specifically at 4 samples, 2FE, 6FE, 23K number 1, and 7FE number 1. And he was able to confirm in his report that these were definitely 100% not mixtures, which is, the claim that was made. You were saying that the theory that the blood samples might have been mixtures was the likely, not for sure, but the likely reason why I was not granted a pardon. And we now have clarity on this. What does that significantly mean now? What do we know now that we didn't know before?
Well, I think it significantly bolsters, if not makes conclusive, our longtime argument that you are, in fact, innocent of the crimes for which you were convicted. Because if the forensic evidence, the DNA testing, if you will, if, in fact, it's reliable, and if it reliably shows that you weren't there, somebody else was there, one or more other males. I mean, that's what we know from the testing that Dr. McClintock and his colleague did. If we know that for a fact, and you put that together with all the other evidence, what I call circumstantial evidence of your innocence, I think that makes it conclusive that you are, in fact, factually innocent of these crimes.
I obviously agree with you, but I'm not the person who's really got the fairest point of view on this. Just for the viewers to briefly summarize and don't know this, I have a separate series of videos on this with these reports attached. There are 2 samples of type O blood that have a different DNA profile from mine, and I have type O blood. And then there are 2 samples of male AB blood, and Nancy Haysom had AB blood, Derek Haysom had A blood. So a male person was neither one of the victims and was not me with AB blood. So that's where that comes from. And there's absolutely no DNA of mine at the crime scene. We knew that before, and that was confirmed here. But there's the reliability of the DNA test, which was up in the air to some extent at the time I was granted parole. The reliability of the DNA test has now been confirmed.
I agree with that. There's some background information that your viewers might be interested here to help explain why the likely reason that the lab took the position back in the 20-teens when your pardon petition was under consideration by the governor, took the position that the blood samples were mixtures. Do you want to get into that?
Please.
Okay. Well, as you well know, Virginia's Department of Forensic Science has not always had the most stellar of reputations. In fact, we know from numerous examples from the history of what was done in that department and the positions that people, scientists, so-called scientists, I'll say, in that department took in numerous criminal cases, that they were more often than not functioned more as tools of the prosecution than as objective, independent scientists trying to reach a scientific conclusion. And I mean, the most famous of these discredited scientists, and she's no longer alive to be able to defend herself, but there's no debate about how biased she was in her work, is a woman named Mary Jane Burton. And everybody in the defense bar knows about how bad she was and how she basically gave the prosecution the answers the prosecution wanted when she would issue her reports. Now, she wasn't involved in whatever report was issued back in the 20-teens when your pardon petition was under consideration. It would have been someone else. But I believe that the culture had not changed all that much at the time that happened, and that somebody in that department gave the parole board the answer that the parole board wanted. I believe, we don't know this, but I believe that there were people at the parole board, even when it was a good parole board, who didn't want you to get a pardon. And so they were happy, they being the parole board at that time, was happy to get a conclusion from the Department of Forensic Science that the blood samples were mixtures and therefore couldn't be relied upon, and therefore our indisputable scientific evidence of your innocence could not be relied upon. And therefore, Governor, I don't know this, but I speculate this, therefore, Governor, we recommend that you deny the pardon. I think that's what happened. Don't know if we'll ever find out for sure. Maybe we will, because the information is out there. The bottom line is that I think we were done in with respect to your pardon by a culture in the Department of Forensic Science that was not as scientific as it should have been.
I agree completely. Just for viewers to know, what Steve Northup is saying here is not his personal point of view. That the Department of Forensic Sciences in Virginia particularly has a really bad reputation is like known throughout the defense bar in Virginia, that everybody knows this. And recently, there's been a podcast specifically about Mary Jane Burton called Admissible Shreds of Evidence, which has gained a lot of notoriety because somebody, an ex-employee of the Department of Forensic Sciences, laid it all out. What happened, how science was misused as a tool to help the prosecution convict people, and sometimes they convicted the wrong people. We know for sure Mary Jane Burton is responsible for the wrongful conviction of Willie Davidson. He's in the National Registry of Exonerations. And so we know that this happened. This is not something you're just alleging. There are facts to back this up, and independent journalists have confirmed this. Apparently it's changing, and that's a hopeful sign. But there was a culture at the Department of Forensic Sciences that they will deliver the test results that the prosecution wants. And in this particular case, if I understood you correctly, you believe that they delivered the scientific opinion calling into question the reliability of the DNA test that they thought the parole board wanted to hear so that they could deny my pardon.
To state it correctly, so that they could recommend to the governor that he deny your pardon, which we know is what happened.
And we now also know that perhaps because of this new culture at the parole board, Professor McClintock was able to go back into the Department of Forensic Sciences, look at the actual raw data from back then, and he was able to confirm in the presence of an employee of the Department of Forensic Sciences that there was no mixture. And, there's a written report on this that I'm going to attach in the video description. This happened in the summer of 2022. Professor McClintock went there actually on my birthday, August 1st, 2022, and then he filed this report on August 8th, 2022. Mm-hmm. And what I do not understand, and I would like to hear from you about this, is nobody's reported on this, except for one television reporter in Lynchburg, Virginia, Noreen Turret. She's the only one who's reported on this. This has not been reported in Virginia. It's not been reported in Germany. And it was not included in the Netflix series, which I think is just outrageous. And I know Professor McClintock, whom I've been in contact with about this, he's really, really angry about that. Because, he went way out of his way to do this back in 2022. And nobody's talking about it, even though it kind of solves the case. Why do you think people are not reporting about it?
I don't know what efforts there have been to get the media to report on this. So I really don't know, but it baffles me.
Well, I have certainly approached the media about it, and Professor McClintock told the Netflix people about it in great detail. They just cut it out of the Netflix series. They just didn't want it in there.
Well, that suggests to me that whoever was doing the Netflix series had bias about what actually happened in your case, and they didn't want to present anything that was inconsistent with their bias.
I suspect they had commercial motives, right? They wanted to keep suspense up in the air, to keep viewers interested, and this DNA test that Professor McClintock did in 2022, it kind of removes the suspense. There's no longer any question about this now, so you can't reduce it to he said, she said with the DNA. Thank you for doing this and speaking with me today.
Thanks, Jens. Nice talking to you.